crimes of a monster instead.
The US, Britain and France launch airstrikes saying Syria has used chemical weapons and needs to be held accountable.
This was not about interfering in a civil war, and it was not about regime change.
British Prime Minister Theresa May explains why the UK took part. Welcome to Al Jazeera, live from our headquarters in Doha with me, Elizabeth Puranam. Also ahead, hours after his country is hit by airstrikes, the Syrian government releases video of President Bashar al-Assad said to be on his way to work. And supporters of the Syrian regime take to the streets of Damascus, waving flags and cheering their government. It is 11 GMT and we are continuing our coverage of the most significant attack yet by the US, UK and France against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Washington and its closest allies launched over 100 missiles and targeted strikes aimed at degrading and destroying the Assad government's chemical weapons. It is the first coordinated Western retaliation against the regime after last weekend's suspected chemical attack in Douma, which killed at least 40 people. Well, British Prime Minister Theresa May insists that the strikes were not aimed at regime change. France is threatening more attacks if Assad continues to use chemical weapons. Well, Saturday's military action has put Western powers in conflict with Assad's close allies, Russia and Iran. Vladimir Putin is demanding an urgent UN Security Council meeting to discuss what he called aggressive actions of US and its allies. And Iran is warning of regional consequences. Well, let's take a look at where the missiles dropped. The first target was a scientific research center in the greater Damascus area. The Pentagon says it was used for the production and testing of chemical and biological warfare technology. 2 more sites were targeted west of Homs. Both were chemical weapons storage facilities. That's according to the Pentagon. One of them was also a military command center. Well, the Russian Defense Ministry says Syrian forces shot down dozens of missiles launched by the US and its allies.
Syrian forces repelled some attacks. 71 cruise missiles were intercepted. Syrian forces were activated. Russia has fully restored the system of air defense over Syria and continues to improve it over the past 6 months. We refuse to supply Syria with the Zenit S-300 missile. Taking into account what has happened, I consider it necessary to reconsider this issue, not in respect to Syria, but also in respect to other states. We think that this strike was not in response to the alleged chemical attack, but it is against the armed forces of Syria. The strike was inflicted on the day when Damascus should start a special mission of investigation into the incident in Douma. Allegedly, chemical weapons were used there. I want to call your attention that none of the objects of the production of chemical weapons exist in Syria. That was established by the Organization for Prevention of Chemical Weapons. This fact of American aggression testifies that there is no interest of the USA to have an objective investigation, but an aspiration to thwart the process of peaceful settlement and destabilize the situation.
And our Russia correspondent Rory Challens is joining us live from the capital now. The Defense Ministry spokesperson there, Rory, very much maintaining what Russia has been saying over the past week. What are Russia's options, though, in terms of how to respond to this?
Well, from listening to what's being said in Russia today, lines that are coming out of the Kremlin, a statement released by the President Vladimir Putin, and things that were said by ambassadors, etc., and the Ministry of Defense, I'm not actually sure that they are looking to do that much at the moment. Vladimir Putin has talked in harsh language about the attack itself. That's exactly as you would expect. He has said that it is, essentially the United States doing the same thing that it did a year ago when it attacked the Shayrat air base, using allegations of a chemical weapons attack to justify lashing out against the Syrian government and its assets in Syria. But beyond that, he goes on to say that they're calling for a UN Security Council resolution, or a UN Security Council meeting to be convened to condemn the attack. The Russian ambassador to the United States only says that there will be consequences for this. So I think generally what we're looking at here is a Russian leadership that perhaps is assessing what's happened over the last few hours and is not that bothered by it. It has to say it's bothered, but I think it's seen the extent of the US, UK and French strikes and seen that they are limited. 3 facilities connected, so the Allies say, with Russia's chemical weapons program, but Syria's chemical weapons program. But beyond that, I think they're thinking, well, this could have been a lot worse. They could have hit Russian assets. They could have hit more Syrian assets. They could have hit Iranian assets, and they haven't done that. So this, I think Russia is thinking at the moment, is the acceptable cost of what it's doing.
Rory, thank you very much for that. That is Rory Challens joining us live from Moscow. Well, British Prime Minister Theresa May says there was no alternative way to stop the Assad government from using chemical weapons.
Last night, British, French and American armed forces conducted coordinated and targeted strikes to degrade the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deter their use. This was not about interfering in a civil war, and it was not about regime change. As I discussed with President Trump and President Macron, it was a limited, targeted and effective strike with clear boundaries that expressly sought to avoid escalation and did everything possible to prevent civilian casualties. We would have preferred an alternative path, but on this occasion there is none. We cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalised.
Our UK correspondent Barnaby Phillips is joining us live from London for more on this, and British Prime Minister Theresa May saying that they had no alternative but to act, but stressing, Barnaby, what she said was the very limited nature of their participation in these strikes.
Yes, as you heard in that clip, the British government emphasising that this was not an attempt to intervene in Syria's civil war. I think everyone in London in political circles realises that ship sailed a long time ago, even if intervention was desirable. That point has long passed, and that it was not aimed at regime change either. I think you have to remember the context of British public opinion, I would say, is more haunted by what is seen as the debacle of Iraq than any other country, and so that sets the bar quite high and puts a Prime Minister, after all, who doesn't have a parliamentary majority, somewhat on the defensive. And also, of course, she'll remember very well the uncomfortable situation of 2013 when her predecessor, David Cameron, lost a vote over British military action in Parliament against the Syrian government at that point of view. So she's quite constrained, and she has to sell what Britain has done in quite specific terms to a British public that she fears may well be sceptical about where this action will lead. Because it's one thing, of course, to say that action is limited, but once you've taken it, you don't always control the circumstances that follow. And there are awkward questions. What if the British government believes that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons in a week's time or 2 weeks' time? Does Britain use military action again?
And all of this, Barnaby, while we still wait for that investigation from the chemical weapons watchdog, the OPCW, which is one of course, many reasons why we had the opposition Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, saying that this is something that should have gone to Parliament, that should have had parliamentary approval.
Yes, Jeremy Corbyn, his words are that this act was legally questionable. And I think there are voices across the British political spectrum, not only on the left, but some voices, a minority of voices within her governing Conservative Party, who will be queasy about the fact that there were OPC W operatives on the ground trying to work out what happened in Duma. The government's response is that this was operationally necessary. I think perhaps what they won't say in public, but there was also a political decision for Britain to be walking lockstep with its American and French allies at this point in time. And the government, if we take its assurances at face value, and we have to, they seem to be very sure of their own intelligence, very confident of their own intelligence, that the Assad regime did use chemical weapons in Duma last week.
Barnaby, thank you very much for that. For now, that's Barnaby Phillips live in London. Now, while Russia says some 71 missiles were shot down throughout Syria, Syrian state media has released their own video and numbers. The government video is said to show Syrian air defense missiles fired to counter the attack. The Assad regime claims it shot down 13 incoming missiles over Damascus. More than 100 missiles were fired at Syria.
We stress that this kind of aggression will not stop our army. Our alliance will continue targeting terrorist groups across the country. This will strengthen us, and we will continue to defend our sovereignty and our homeland and people's security.
Well, Syrians gathered on the streets of Damascus condemned the strikes.
We did not sleep at night. Honestly, we went to the street to support the army, and the Air Force shot down the missiles. We are strong, and they've been attacking and conspiring against Syria for 8 years, but Syria is strong.
We were watching and we have footage. We can say we feel afraid, but we were sure that we were going to shoot them down.
Well, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad says the strikes have hardened his resolve to fight what he calls terrorism in his country. Earlier in the day, Syrian state television showed pictures of him walking into his office in Damascus. Assad spoke to the leader of Iran on Saturday. President Hassan Rouhani said Tehran will continue to stand by Syria. But let's go there now, and we're joined by Sadek Zibakalam, Professor of Political Science at the University of Tehran. Very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. So we have, of course, heard from the Iranians who are not at all happy about these strikes. But will they respond, and will they do so militarily, do you think?
I doubt very much if there would be any military reaction, any military response from the Iranian side. Of course, the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has been very defiant today, because today is a great festive of the prophecy of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and ambassadors of Islamic countries, Arab countries, and dignitaries went to visit him. And the Iranian Supreme Leader, he was very defiant. He called the United States President, as well as the France President, as criminals, as well as the British Prime Minister. And if anything, judging from the Iranian Supreme Leader, the Iranians are very angry. At the same time, they are very, very, very much defiant. And as I said, there won't be any likelihood of any Iranian military response.
Right, so defiant, but they're not likely to react. And as we've been reporting, President Hassan Rouhani has said that he is going to stand by the Syrian president. Nevertheless, do you think that given this is the biggest action we've seen by the US in Syria in these 7 years of war, will it make the Iranians rethink in any way their involvement in Syria, especially given that there is opposition to Iranian involvement in Syria in Iran itself, as we saw in protests over the last year?
Increasingly, more and more Iranians have become critical of Iranian Islamic regime support for Bashar Assad regime. for example, last week there were some demonstration by people in Isfahan province, farmers, against some water dispute, and they were chanting that forget Syria and do something for us. And such slogans have been going on amongst Iranian who are protesting against the government. But I don't think there would be any change. Rather, I think we would see more support from Damascus, from Tehran.
So public sentiment then will not put any pressure on the Iranian government and the Iranian regime, you're saying, because ultimately the decisions are made by the Revolutionary Guard, I take it.
Yes, you could say that Iran's policy towards Islamic regime's policy towards Syria is not very much conducted by the Iranian parliament, nor for that matter by Rouhani government. It's actually directed by the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guard.
Mr. Zibakalam, thank you as always for your time. We do appreciate it. That is Sadek Zibakalam joining us live from Tehran. Thank you. Still ahead on the bulletin, the red carpet rolls out for leaders of the Americas and Peru, but some are not invited. And remembering the mother of the nation, South Africans pay their respects as Winnie Madikizela Mandela is laid to rest.
Hello, yet another